very good afternoon to you all. Very warm welcome to this webinar, exciting webinar about climate stress testing, where we'll cover all the things that you want to know about climate stress testing. My name is Franziska. I'm European Network Manager at ShareAction, and I'm here with Camilla de Thomä, who is Senior Policy Officer at ShareAction. ShareAction is a UK-based charity that promotes responsible investment. Our aim is to create an investment system that is accountable, transparent, and benefits society and the environment. We're holding today's webinar as part of the European Responsible Investment Network. It's a network for not-for-profit organizations that have an interest in campaigning for sustainable investment matters. Do get in touch if you'd like to find out more. A few matters of housekeeping. You should all be muted by now, but if not, please make sure to do this, just to ensure good sound quality, and don't share your screen or start your video just in case. If you've got any questions, you can type those into the chat box or ask them at the very end after we finish the presentations. If there's any issues with the program, we recommend just rejoining a few times. That normally helps. And also, just to let you know, we're recording this session and we'll distribute the recording afterwards. So if you miss any bits, you can re-listen them. So the reason why we're setting up this, or we've set up this webinar, is that everyone's talking about climate stress testing. There's definitely some uncertainty about what it actually means, why climate stress testing may be needed, what are the risks for financial stability, and what are the risks for individual financial institutions, and also how climate stress tests can be carried out in a meaningful way. It's quite topical with a report from the FSB Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures coming out soon. We may touch upon this briefly as well. Okay, we're very excited to have some, three excellent speakers to explore these questions and more. First is Rens van Tilburg, Executive Secretary at the Sustainable Finance Lab at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, been working on financial reform for a while, and he'll be talking about what climate risks are, what role regulators can play, and touch upon the Dutch context as well. We've got Franziska Schütze from the Global Climate Forum, who will be introducing a study by the University of Zurich and Global Climate Forum on the climate stress test of European financial system, and and she'll do some remarks on data limitations as well. And then we've got Jakob, Thomä, Director at the 2 Degrees Investing Initiative, who'll be talking about what individual investors can do to manage climate risks in their portfolios, as well as touching on the French context, and then we'll take questions as mentioned. So without further ado, we'll kick off with Rens and his presentation. So Rens, if you're happy, then we can kick off.
Yes, thank you. I'm Rens van Tilburg from the Sustainable Finance Lab in the Netherlands. And the Sustainable Finance Lab is a network of economists from almost all Dutch universities, and we are working on sustainability of the financial sector in the broadest sense of the word. When we started about 6 years ago, we were mainly working on the stability of the financial sector, and increasingly we have been focusing also on the ecological side of reforms, and especially trying to make the connection between the discussion on financial stability and sustainability. So I am not seeing my own slides yet. So I hope you are seeing those. Are you?
I can say we're seeing the slide, global emissions and temperature increase for various concentration levels.
Okay. So then we're at my third slide already.
Okay.
what we see here is just to illustrate where we are standing, specifically the kind of transition that we're facing. So the red line shows that the 2-degree line that we as a global community have said we don't want to trespass. And we see different scenarios, and there's only one scenario where we have a 50% chance of sticking to that red line. And all the other scenarios, we see temperature increases up to 5 degrees. And then to see what kind of transition that means, we see in the left-hand picture that there is a very strong trend change needed. So what we can say is that we are currently in a very big imbalance. And then we move to the next slide, which I think very easily shows what I will be talking about. We start from this imbalance position that we are in at the moment, and actually there's two scenarios, and probably in the end we will end up somewhere in the middle. But on the one hand, getting from the current situation, so the left picture shows that is that we will not have a big change in the trend of emissions, and then the new equilibrium that we will reach in some decades will be one in which the global temperature will be much higher, and getting there will bring us a lot of what are called physical risks. So the climate is changing, and that will have profound consequences. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a scenario in which this 2-degree threshold will be reached, and that will mean that the economy will go through a large transition, and a lot of the investments that have been made, which might be profitable for years to come, in a scenario in which there was no transition, they will become so-called stranded assets, as is illustrated here by this oil tanker in the desert. So then we move to the next slide to show what this means for the carbon reserves that are known at the moment. So that is the oil, the gas, and the coal that is still underground, but we know that it's there. And essentially it means that 60 to 80% of that cannot be burned. So that is in essence the so-called carbon bubble scenario or hypothesis. It means that a lot of the assets that are fossil fuel related are actually stranded assets, if you would take into account the fact that we might go to this scenario of only a 2-degree global warming. Well, then the next slide shows you the picture of our report from 2014, which we wrote for the Greens in the European Parliament to look at the impact of the carbon bubble on the EU financial system. And for that we have been working together with Profundo, with whom we have looked at the portfolio of the 20 biggest banks and pension funds of Europe. And the next slide shows you to what we have been looking there. So the financial impact of the carbon bubble, we distinguish there's the direct effects within the sectors of fossil fuel companies themselves. And then there are the indirect effects, because a carbon bubble scenario will of course not be limited only to those fossil fuel companies, but will have effects in the whole economy. Think, for instance, about automotive, where certain auto manufacturers might win with this transition if they are, for instance, very active with electrical vehicles, while others might lose out a lot. But as you can see from the dark line around, we only look at the direct effects. So in that sense, and it's important to keep in mind that all the results that we come up with are of course an underestimation of what in fact will be the impact. So then the next slide shows you the scenario that we have quantified. We call that a low carbon breakthrough. And in that scenario, there will be a quick and definite transition to a low carbon economy. And this is actually not only from an environmental point of view the best scenario to be in, because if we look at the consequences, there will be a sudden loss on high carbon assets, but it will, and it's a big number, because for the whole European financial sector, we estimated this to be between the 350 and 400 billion euros. But then if you, which is a big number, but of course the balance sheet of the banks and the pension funds and insurance companies are quite big as well. So if you see this loss as a percentage of their assets, it's mainly in the pension funds with 3% that there is quite some impact. But with the EU banks with 4.4% of assets in itself, that will not be such a hard hit. Even though, of course, if the banks are already weakly capitalized, this might impact them much harder. However, we conclude that this is unlikely to trigger any harmful feedback loops. So from a stability point of view, this scenario would not be a problem. So that's the macroeconomic conclusion. Then the next slide shows you some of the results for the different pension funds. And here you see that there are big differences between pension funds, especially the UK pension funds. They can have quite higher losses, which is because they are quite heavily invested in the London Stock Exchange, where there are many fossil fuel companies and mining companies. And you see that other pension funds will be impacted much less. Well, then the next scenario that we looked at is the so-called uncertain transition, which will lead to at least larger losses. Here you have the annual expenditures of 500 billion a year for finding new fossil fuel reserves, and they will be ongoing. So in a sense, from a financial stability point of view, this is a less desired outcome, even though in the end here we will stay within the carbon budget. And then the third and last scenario, we call that the carbon renaissance, where climate change is ineffective, and we will get into this uncontrollable climate change, of which, well, the costs, there are calculations of that, and they show that there are a multiple of the previous two scenarios. So then the conclusions that we arrive at, we say that first of all, there is serious money at stake. Specific financial institutions could encounter serious problems. However, as I stated, there is no financial stability argument against effective climate policy now. Far from it. Actually, the longer we wait, the more expensive it will get, and the bigger, therefore, also the stability risk. So what has been the impact of these kind of studies as we have seen over the last few years? To start with the regulators, I think increasingly we see that the materiality of these scenarios is acknowledged. Earlier this year we had an informal ECOFIN meeting here in Amsterdam, where we presented also our papers. And it was judged that this should be something which is high on the agenda of regulators. The FSB was already mentioned, so, and the G20, they just came up with a report on this. So increasingly regulators are looking at it. However, they're still very much in the phase of asking questions and demanding transparency from financial institutions. Those financial institutions are increasingly setting themselves goals for the exposure and engagement they have in this field. But what is interesting is that this is largely done without any real risk assessment at the moment. And that's surprising, because if we go to the next slide, we see a picture from this G20 study that was done by the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. where you see what is a sort like the logical way to have your risk policy, which starts by the identification. So you recognize that it's a material risk. Then the next step is that you see what is your exposure to the risk, and then the next step is to have this risk assessment to see how can this risk impact my institution in a financial way, and based on that you would get to mitigation measures. Well, what you see, and of course the Paris Agreement has a lot to do with that as well, is that financial institutions are increasingly setting themselves goals for their exposure without actually really knowing what the risk assessment is, which of course is positive in the sense that they will reduce their exposure and probably with that also their risk. But it is not a one-on-one that every carbon exposure has the same kind of financial risk. So I think there's a lot to win in this risk assessment. Then lastly, to look at what the regulators can do more. We'll get to the next slide, which shows a table of a paper that I wrote with the Schoenmaker, where we looked to the macroprudential policy of regulators and looked at the criteria for which kind of risks should be taken into account from a systemic stability point of view. And when you look at that, you see that, for instance, housing, so real estate, that ticks all the boxes. That's sort of like the classical example of macroprudential policy that is focused on housing. But for instance, shipping, which also has very long-lived investments, but it's only quite a small share in the economy. Therefore, it is not concern of macroprudential policymakers. And for instance, the ICT investments, the dot-com boom that we had in the 90s, also ticks two boxes, but it's mostly not debt financed, and for that reason, when the debt bubble popped, there was not a big instability. Well, carbon does tick all the boxes, so from that point we say, well, you should be looking at it. And then we go to the next slide, but quickly to the slide with the cyclical pillar, because this macroprudential policy framework has a cyclical pillar and a structural pillar, and we say that probably the best instrument to be used is to within the cyclical pillar where the risk weights are adjusted for certain higher risks, and we think that this would be the logical place for regulators to increase their risk weighting, and thus to discourage investments in carbon intensive investments. So we go 2 slides further to the one called Way Forward. What needs to be done? Well, we think especially what is needed is that more risk scenarios are developed, not only looking at the direct effects in the fossil fuel sectors themselves, but also throughout the whole economy. And based on the stress test that you can do with that, this risk weights that we were talking about before, they can then be calibrated, and it would be good if this would become part of the regular peer review process that the global regulators have through the financial sector assessment program. So thank you very much, and on the last slide it shows the 2 publications that I have been talking about.
Great, thank you very much for that presentation. We're going to have a chance to ask questions to all of the speakers at the end, but if anyone has any questions already that they want to send us in the chat, so you're first in the queue when the Q&A opens later, please go ahead. But now I'd like to pass over to our second speaker, Franziska Schütze from the Global Climate Forum. So Franziska, take it away.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Franziska Schütze from the Global Climate Forum. I'm a researcher here and have been working on a joint study with Stefano Battistone from the University of Zurich within one of our EU research projects called SIMPOM. And we have also published a working paper version on SSRN, which you can see the sort of ID there. But if you're interested, I can also send the link or the paper around later. And we're also in the process of publishing it. So on the first slide, I can sort of want to say that sort of our work was inspired by sort of the growing discussion around financial impacts of climate change or climate policies, and so the whole stranded assets carbon bubble discussion, and sort of the aim in the project was to combine climate policy issues with financial stability issues. So this was like an interesting field of research for us. And the University of Zurich has worked on financial stability issues for many years with a more complexity systems approach by using network analysis and network models. And so we sort of introduced climate related and climate policy related questions into the analysis. And because the studies we've seen at the time when we started this didn't really take into account feedback effects in financial markets, so we wanted to look this was sort of the focus of our or the aim of our study, to look more into the second and third round effects. And so uncertainty plays a big role here, especially uncertainty about policy choices and policy pathways and technologies as well. And so uncertainty sort of adds to this complexity problem, and that there can be feedback effects and instability. And on the next slide, we can see that. So let me see what's on the next slide.
Yeah, we can see it.
So this sort of just shows the combination of financial stability and carbon risk, carbon bubble issues, which led to this methodology to assess exposures of financial actors to climate policy risks, and especially to take into account feedback effects. Yeah, so the methodology on the next slide was the first step was to reclassify the sectors in the financial database we were using. This was mainly, we mainly worked on equity relations or equity shares. And in the database we were using, the sectors are classified in NACE codes, which is standard classification, but doesn't carry much information about climate sensitivity or climate impacts. And so we looked into the different NACE codes, and so there you can see, for example, in transportation you also have oil pipelines and gas pipelines, which then actually we put into the fossil fuel sector. So not only the initial sectors, but also related services and other sectors that are related to this. So we sort of reclassification of these sectors was the first step, and then on the next slide, the next step was then to look into the first round effects, where we looked at different types of investors, different groups of actors, and their individual vulnerability through their equity holdings. And then we also grouped them into, for example, here in a second, the banking sector, but you can also we also looked at investment funds, for example. And then for the banks especially, we also looked at second round effects through the interbank lending market. So interlinkages between banks with their counterparties. And for that we used an algorithm or an analysis called that rank tool, which is from the University of Zurich, Stefano Battistone. And sort of there we combine these first round and second round effects. And on the next slide we can see some results of the first round effect, where we looked into different sectors. So one, you can look at the sectors on the one hand and the actors as well. Can we look at the next slide?
Is that the one results direct equity exposure or the one before?
Yeah. No, the one before.
Okay.
One before.
Yeah.
Yeah, it always takes a bit. Yeah, okay, so there we can see the exposures of, through equity holdings, of different actors. So for example, investment funds, here you can see have the largest shares of market capital, or own the largest market capitalization in total. But so in general, if you look at the different sectors that we sort of classified, fossil fuel sector has a relatively small share of the equity holdings. But then if we look at the energy intensive industries, there we can actually see a much larger exposure. So so one conclusion here is that not only fossil fuel sector itself is maybe not the biggest, doesn't have the biggest exposure, but if you also add other sectors which might be affected by climate policy, then the effects can become much larger. And on the other hand, on the next slide, we also looked into so there you can see on the x-axis fraction of equity portfolio, that's again sort of the share of the equity portfolio in this sector. Here we only look at fossil fuel and utility sector, but you can do this so in the methodology you can do it for all sectors individually, but also on a more aggregate level, so you can add more sectors and then see what is the fraction of the equity portfolio. And there, for example, we can see that governments have a higher share of their equity portfolio in fossil fuels and utility sectors. And we have a sort of a second measure that we call, that is the fraction of market capitalization in this sector, which we see as sort of a measure of influence sort of on this sector. So investment funds, for example, own a larger share of the market capitalization in these sectors. So you could say that they have a potentially higher influence maybe in these sectors. But in general, you see that there is a sort of the exposure is very heterogeneous among groups of actors, but also within actor groups. So between different banks, for example, or different investment funds. And on the next slide, we can see the specific case for banks, where you can see again sort of the heterogeneous sort of dimension of the risk, where you can see different banks some banks have very large first round effects, others have very large or very small first round effects, but larger second round effects through their interbank relations. In the table you can see again the first round relative equity loss of fossil fuel is rather small, or not very big, and fossil fuel plus utilities is not much bigger, but if you add energy intensive industries, then it already increases considerably. And if you add second round effects, then we get to roughly double the effect of the first round effect. And so what we showed was that depending on which actors you're interested in, you can see very different results, very heterogeneous sort of exposures between, but also within actor groups. And on the next slide, that is just sort of an attempt to show sort of what the different dimensions or of the carbon risk landscape sort of are. So you have different risk types, but you also have different sectors you can be or you can look into, and also different channels. One is more of a cost impact, so higher CO2 prices or energy prices, or an impact on revenues, or on the evaluation of physical assets. And the blue part is sort of what we focused on so far, more the fossil fuel industry, utilities and energy intensive industries, and mainly on equity shares. But on the next slide, also sort of the from looking at the different portfolios of different kinds of financial actors, we also sort of pointed at the potential systemic effect through interlinkages between, for example, banks, so through the interbank lending market, but also banks hold a relatively small share of their total assets in equity at all, which is around 3.8%, around 4% maybe. And the rest, or the largest portion of banks' assets, are loans to non-financial corporations, households, through mortgages and interbank lending. So, sort of the indirect effects should also be considered. And for example, pension funds also hold shares in investment funds and so on. So we sort of wanted to also look at this systemic dimension, but obviously we're not through, and there's a lot of problems also, or limitations on the data side. And so for equity, for example, there is public information on this, but for loans there's less information, at much more aggregate level. And for other things like commodities and so on, I think Rens, who was talking about their study earlier, they also looked into commodities. So on the next slide, was it? No, actually. No, it was already on earlier, but it doesn't matter. So next to equity, there's also commodities and property and so on. So there's many different levels to be considered. And what we also looked into, in which I can only show now this picture, but we're publishing this soon, I think, was that we looked at different scenarios that we inferred from a more macroeconomic model, or different models and different policy scenarios, where we here in this case looked at renewable-based utilities, and so on the right-hand side of the picture, sorry if I didn't write it there, it's renewable-based utilities and the sort of distribution of positive and negative shocks that can come from different policy scenarios. And on the left-hand side, you see the sort of distribution of shocks on fossil fuel-based utilities. So, and these sort of different distributions of shocks we used for our analysis for the shocks on banks, and then looked at sort of what is the distribution of losses in the banking sector or total financial sector. And this we did also to show that there are also there can be also positive effects, obviously, not only negative effects. And the question is then which actors are invested in the more sort of the less carbon intensive or more carbon intensive companies. And so also the distribution of shocks depend very much on the portfolio there. So yeah, I think I don't have many big conclusions, because I think it's research on this has actually only started, and I agree with a lot of the conclusions that Rens was already making earlier, that uncertainty about future policies and technologies plays a big role, and that the sort of the direct effect or financial stability issue, there's not really we don't think there's a big financial stability issue if you only look at fossil fuel sectors but if you add other sectors and other sort of more systemic perspectives, then your conclusion might be different. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of data limitations, and so really making big conclusions here is not the time for it yet, I think. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Franziska. And our next speaker we're going to hand over to is Jakob Thomä from 2 Degrees Investing. So over to you.
Thanks a lot. I hope everybody can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you as well for the introduction and the opportunity to speak today. My name is Jakob Thomä. I'm director at the 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the toolbox around assessing transition risk and options for investors to start integrating some of this thinking into their risk assessment on the equity or credit side. So next slide, please. Most of you will perhaps heard of 2 Degrees Investing, but just as a very brief introduction, we are a global think tank working on climate-related alignment and risk metrics in financial markets and associated policies. We co-initiated the first 2-degree financial regulation in France in the form of mandatory climate risk and clinical alignment disclosure for French institutional investors, the infamous or famous perhaps by now Article 173. We've also developed the first open source 2-degree alignment model for listed equity and corporate bond portfolios that have now been tested by over 100 institutional investors worldwide and are in the process of being tested by 3 financial regulators in Europe. And we are involved in research with over 40 research partners and lead a €5 million worth of research projects on climate metrics. So next slide, please. As I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about what is in this transition risk toolbox. And next slide, please. There are probably 3 elements that are worth highlighting. The first is transition risk scenarios. So these are, usually known as the kind of scenarios you might see from the IEA. But as I will highlight in a little bit, these likely need to be enriched, building on Rens' comment that we need more transition risk scenarios. Next slide, please. The second element is transition and financial data. And so one of the key ideas is that with the advent of asset-level databases and economic intelligence databases, financial institutions are now in a much better position to be able to assess transition risk in countries and for specific regions and specific policy frameworks. And finally, of course, next slide, please, are the transition risk models. Sorry, the one after that are the transition risk models. So basically the infrastructure that matches the scenarios and the financial data. So I'll talk about each of these in turn. Next slide, please. And before doing that, I just want to highlight perhaps two key mistakes to avoid, if you will. Next slide, please. And so basically the 2 kind of key issues that we think are important when thinking about transition risk assessment are 2 major disconnects. The first is that company risk doesn't equal one-to-one, can't be translated one-to-one to financial risk. So a lot of the transition risk literature is focused on the impacts of companies. Rens mentioned the 60 to 80% of fossil fuel reserves that are likely to be unburnable under a 2-degree transition. However, this obviously doesn't mean that 60 to 80% of the market value of an oil and gas company is affected. So financial analysts may have different view and already price certain trends that companies may not yet take into account or respond to. And the second critical element is the distinction between the objective to improve asset pricing. So the idea that transition risks aren't accurately integrated into asset prices today, and so integrating them would improve the pricing of financial assets and by extension the intermediation of capital in financial markets. So that could be one objective. The other objective is more of a resilience assessment related to tail risks related to the transition. So that's what we call, what you might call a stress test. Critical to distinguish the 2 because a lot of the debate around the FSB task force, for example, has been around reporting 2-degree transition risk for companies. But if the analysts assume that the probability of a 2-degree pathway is perhaps only 5%, then this type of assessment or information is unlikely to move asset prices significantly. And so as part of the transition risk modeling, understanding or deciding at which level the model is meant to operate and whether the model is meant to improve asset prices or transition risk is a key feature. Next slide, please. So moving into data, next slide, please. So these are just some of the requirements we think are needed to have valuable transition risk data for transition risk assessment. Because transition risk articulates itself in many cases based on country-level policies, production or service data likely needs to be at country level and is aggregated by technology. Many policy incentives are going to be specific to certain technologies, emission standards, or perhaps incentives for electric vehicles. And so data disaggregated by technology is another critical element. Just to highlight as well, another element is the forward-looking nature of data. So understanding the investment profile, the asset profile, and the production plans of company is critical to be able to measure the extent to which forward future regulatory constraints will impact companies' future production plans. And this obviously then also by extension requires a link to the ability to link the data to revenues or CapEx perhaps to understand how this exactly feeds through. And so it's important to highlight this because a lot of the focus of reporting frameworks has been on company level reporting, which frequently doesn't provide this level of granularity. Next slide, please. Which leads us to believe, next slide, please, thanks. Which leads us to believe that the starting point for transition risk assessment is in many cases and for many sectors asset level data. So these are just some of the data points that you might want to rely upon for the different sectors. The model, the 2-degree alignment model that I mentioned earlier, relies on these data sets of 100,000 power plants, 22,000 oil and gas fields, 95 million produced cars that can be localized by longitude, latitude, production factors, and investment profile. And so in our view, that's really the starting point to be able to understand for an equity portfolio or even a debt portfolio how this portfolio is positioned against some of the scenarios that I'll talk about in a little bit. Now, next slide, please. The key challenge that we see in this is matching these physical asset level data points to companies. And so that's not really something that's been done at a comprehensive level. Company structures are obviously highly complex. And so this is really a key challenge when using physical asset level data is this matching. Some of the options here that we are exploring, for example, as part of our research, but that obviously other actors are looking at as well, is S&P Cross-Reference Service, Orbis database from the University of Zurich, with whom we partner on this exercise, to be able to match physical assets to owners and to the owners of the owners, and then ultimately, next slide please, to financial databases, so to be able to map that to securities, and then finally, next slide please, to the portfolios. And those could of course be your portfolios, or you can use third-party data to assess other funds or other portfolios that you might be looking at from an asset owner's perspective, for example, Morningstar database or the mutual fund databases. Next slide, please. So the second tool, if you will, are the scenarios. So obviously the scenarios differ on a range of different indicators: the level of ambition, the speed, the scope, in terms of the regional coverage and the technology beliefs. Some scenarios believe in nuclear power, others don't. And of course as well the time horizon. So these scenarios have a range of distributions in terms of potential future outcomes, and so part of the transition risk modeling exercise requires a decision on basically the belief that you have or that you want to model against. This can really depend on who the actor is in our view. Financial regulators, for example, and the financial regulators we work with are more interested in a scenario spectrum or fan charts that show a range of outcomes, whereas individual institutional investors might be more interested in looking at scenarios that reflect their specific investment beliefs. However, whichever one you choose, next slide please, one of the key challenges is that traditional scenarios really only focus on the third line here, which is production technology. So that's the primary focus of the scenarios from the IEA, understanding the production profile and the change in technologies and products and services. And that becomes a challenge because many of the risk drivers, as Franziska highlighted, are obviously related to market pricing, policy costs and incentives, which are usually only very vaguely, imprecisely captured in these scenarios. And so from a transition risk perspective, this requires an enriching of the scenarios to cover policy costs and incentives, market pricing, non-conventional factors, and macro trends. So we're working as part of the Energy Transition Risk Project on publishing the first comprehensive energy transition risk scenario in Q1 of next year that can be used as a scenario open source for investors wishing to do this transition risk modeling. Next slide, please. Finally, next slide. Yeah, thank you. Finally, there is the question of the models. So there are obviously different approaches. As part of the Energy Transition Risk Project that we lead, we work with S&P on integrating these pieces into credit risk models, Kepler-Chevreux on valuation models, and some of the work that they've been doing recently that you may be aware of as part of their responsible investor playbook. And we work with CO firm and company level models around margin impact and cash flows. Finally, I mentioned earlier, we've developed this 2-degree alignment model as a free tool for investors where every institutional investor can test the alignment of their equity and bond portfolios. So we're going to be looking at integrating these types of risk factors as well into our SCI metrics project. So I just want to conclude, if I could have the next slide, please, on one key challenge that is associated with all these models. Sorry, next slide after that, which is the challenge that many of these models only have a forecast period of 3 to 5 years, even though many of these risks related to the transition are likely to be much more long-term. So there's various different modeling decisions that could be made around solving this problem. Next slide, please. The first one is to extend the forecast period, which obviously comes with its own set of challenges around the uncertainty related to long-term forecasts and the infrastructure and the costs that this would entail. The second option, sorry, next slide, please. So this would be the first option. The second option is to accelerate the risk to try to move it upwards into the forecast period. Obviously here there are methodological questions about the extent to which it makes sense to assume all the risks happen in the first 5 years and a simple extrapolation. The third option then is to adjust the risk premium to account for the fact that there is increased uncertainty associated with the transition to a low-carbon economy. So from a modeling perspective, beyond the obvious question of at which stage you model, whether it's in the equity space or the credit risk space or portfolio level even, we see really two major challenges. One is this time horizon challenge. The other challenge is deciding how to allocate macroeconomic effects to microeconomic actors. So obviously there are various options here. One is to use what Carbon Tracker has done, cost curves. The other approach is we've piloted is by distributing effects evenly or bottom-up approaches. So these are just two. I just highlighted the time horizon one here visually, but these are just two of the key modeling challenges we expect you to be exposed to. Next slide, please. Now, I know the conversation has been very focused on transition risk today, but I just wanted to close by showing you some of the thinking around the opportunities around physical risk assessment. So basically, physical risk assessment is obviously really a very different challenge with different risk factors that portfolios have an exposure to. But one of the interesting pieces that are worth highlighting is that the data sets used for transition risk assessment can also be mobilized in many cases for physical risk assessment. So what you see here is a chart for a portfolio we've tested recently that shows the percent of each type of power plant and mining, fossil fuel extraction or automobile production that's exposed to low, high, medium, or very high physical risk. And the way this was done was to match each physical asset to map a natural catastrophe map and climate maps over physical assets based on longitude, latitude information to be able to inform on the extent to which these assets are exposed to climate risk, are in areas where climate risks are expected to materialize. So obviously this is very early days and really just early piloting of what's possible in this space. But as Rens highlighted at the beginning, there's two parts of the story here. One is transition risk and one is physical risk. And physical risk, in our view, is really be getting increasing amounts of attention. And we're excited to be doing more work about physical risk side in the next year. So I think my last slide should be the closing one, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, if you're interested in following up, interested in the free 2-degree portfolio test that we offer and the physical risk work we do or in the energy transition risk project involving some of these different actors that I highlighted earlier, shoot me an email or get in touch, and look forward to being in touch with you. Thank you again for the opportunity to present here today.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to Jakob and to all our speakers, some really interesting, very interesting informative presentations. So we've had quite a few questions that have already come through on the chat. So I'll go through those, and then once we've gone through all the questions that we received on the chat, then we can open the phone line to questions from callers. So
the first one was from Jan and Jimmy, I believe. He's asking, so given the great uncertainty around each of the scenarios, I believe this is a question for Rens, but it might be relevant to others as well. Given the great uncertainty around each of these scenarios, how are investors to use these scenarios in a practical manner to shape their investment strategies and risk management? So I believe the emphasis is here on the how to practically make use of them. So Rens, possibly. Or,
okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for the question. Of course, there is uncertainty around this. I think the main point is that investors should be taking these scenarios into account. And of course, there is this discussion of what is the probability of the different scenarios. And like last year, when the Paris Agreement did better than expected, that's the kind of information that makes the probabilities starting to change, and accordingly also then your investment behavior should be changing. But I think that comes from all three presentations. There's a lot of uncertainty at the moment about the kind of scenarios. There's a lot of uncertainty even about the data of the exposure of different companies. What we have not really touched upon is the so-called scope 3, or the indirect effects of companies. Take for instance car companies. We do know quite a lot about the carbon intensity of their own production facilities, but much less is known about the carbon intensity of the use of the cars that they are producing. Well, if you would want to know how certain car manufacturers are performing under different scenarios, I think that's actually the key issue that you need to know. So in that sense, I think the 2-degree assessment of these very concrete data about the production facilities is very important, but there's just a lot of uncertainty in all these scenarios. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any the other speakers wish to comment? If not, we've got a question for Franziska from Robert Schuberg, who's asking what industries were included in the energy-intensive industries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So what we did is, or we didn't want to use sort of our subjective view on what is energy intensive and what not, and what should it be based on, as also explained by Jakob earlier. The question of matching physical asset level data with financial data is a bit is not really solved yet. So what we did here, sort of as a first step, was to use the classification by the EU, by the Commission and Parliament, under the EU ETS, under the trading system, which is I will share the link. It's the sectors deemed, which is called deemed to be exposed to significant risk of carbon leakage. So because they're the sectors that are listed under this list are, so one of the requirements is that I think a carbon price of 30 euro would significantly impact their costs. So, and if they have this requirement, or if they have a high export dependence, or export and import dependence, then they ended up on this list, but the list will be changed soon, I think, or has already changed. So yeah, so this is sort of the reference we took because we wanted to stick to sort of EU level policies. I pasted the link in the chat, so if you want to look at it, I don't know, is it clear or?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether the person is unmuted now, but
Okay.
Right, yeah, no, I just unmuted. Yeah, I can have a look at it. I think that's fairly clear how you
perfect.
Okay, great.
Thank you. So, other questions? You just need to make sure to unmute yourself, or you can type in the text box, whatever is most convenient. So Joel Morland is asking question to all three presenters. Which are the variables and or biggest assumptions that will change their conclusions the most, either in a positive or negative way? Maybe Jakob, would you be happy to go first?
Yes, happy to. So let's take, I mean, there's elements around the data or the scenarios itself. So if you assume, for example, massive breakthrough in CCS technology, then that is likely to have pretty significant impact on the fossil fuel sector, obviously. But from the modeling side, the two things that are likely to impact the results the most, if I take valuation models, are the discount rate or the risk premium, and more generally the time horizon over which cash flows are extrapolated versus actually assessed. So to put this into context, if you take some of the past work done by Kepler-Chevreux and Mark Lewis on fossilized assets stranded revenues, where Mark basically calculated the impact on revenues of different scenarios using IEA oil price assumptions and IEA production assumptions, the impact over 25 years in terms of sum total revenues is the difference of assuming a 7% or 8.5% discount rate. So just 1.5% increase in the discount rate can align a 6-degree cash flow and a 2-degree cash flow. So that assumption is really on the discount rate will have huge impacts on what you expect the asset price to look like in the future. And that's also why the question of risk premium is obviously worth highlighting. The other one is that the time horizon over which the model is actually being applied will have significant impacts as well. The difference between a 6-degree and a 2-degree scenario over the next 5 years in terms of differences in production is a little more than a fudge on a chart. So they're very, very close together. Obviously there's differences, but they're very close together. Whereas over 25 years, there's 40 or 50% difference in the production between a 6-degree and a 2-degree transition. And so those two key factors on the modeling side are going to be critical beyond what you'd expect in terms of the assumptions around the ambition of scenario and different technologies and the like.
Excellent. Franziska or Rens, do jump in if you'd like to contribute.
Yeah. So since we look more into the sort of systemic dimension of the problem, I cannot say that much about the level that Jakob was sort of arguing at. So, but from a sort of financial system perspective, for example, for banks, because we look a lot into equity markets, and also to a degree I think focuses on equity. And but if you also look at loans, for example, then obviously the default rate of loans is one of the key sort of variables. And so that I think is still a bit unclear. Sort of how do default rates of loans change? So, for example, mortgages in Europe, will they be affected, and if so, how much? If sort of the energy labeling directives become more ambitious, and will this have a big effect on valuation of property, and how does this translate into default rates on loans and so on? So I think this is one thing that is not not so clear yet, and I think maybe Rens can talk about this as well. I think they looked into it a bit, and and also sort of the interbank relations play a big role. So regulation on sort of on this sort of on the financial stability dimension might also change the outcome of stress tests. So yeah, I think we have to look, or we should look into more than equity on the one hand, so also loans and bonds and properties and commodities, but also different sectors. So the question earlier was which industry, what is energy intensive industry, and I think depending on how you classify energy intensive industry based on which metric, this would also change our results. So now we chose for the EU ETS classification, but if you choose another one, this might change the result for industry exposure. So and obviously also the policy scenarios. So if you assume that there's a very sudden shift, which is probably not very likely, but if, for example, some major catastrophe would lead to sudden policy shifts, then the sort of revaluations might be much more intense and more sudden and stronger. So I don't know, I think it's hard to say.
Yeah.
Rens?
Maybe just to add, because we did look at also the lending of banks, and as I said, the losses at banks are relatively small, and well, that has of course to do with the fact that the first hit will be taken by the equity investors, but it's also because a lot of the companies that we looked at are actually quite diversified. So the biggest hit with companies is taken by the coal companies. So because of course coal, oil and gas, they're not impacted in an equal manner. But most coal mining companies are also miners in other fields. So in that sense also they mostly take quite a hit on their equity, but they are still able to pay back the loans that they have outstanding. So in that sense, that's why the banks in our study were relatively little hit. But of course we had to make a lot of assumptions about this, and I think our results are quite vulnerable for those assumptions. Well, if you would look more granular into the activities of these companies, you could come up with better estimates, and that would definitely change our results.
Great. Got a question from Camilla here.
Yeah, it's to all the speakers, but maybe to Jakob in particular. So we've heard a lot that there's a lot of questions about methodology and assumptions, and this is still a really evolving field. So I wanted to get the speaker's thoughts on whether campaigners and civil society should be asking regulators and investors to conduct stress tests yet, or whether the methodologies aren't yet, there's enough agreement yet to do that. And maybe if Jakob could answer in relation to France, I believe you have introduced requirements to do stress tests. That would be very interesting.
Sure. So there's always this question of do you kind of wait for the perfect, or do you go with what you have? And it's a bit of a philosophical one, I think, in my view, so I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer, but I would say that basically perhaps more critical than deciding when to move is making sure that we don't lock in current practices, if that makes sense. So one of the critical things as we were working on the Article 173 in France, and I think this is reflected by what the Treasury defined as implementation guidelines, was to avoid a situation where what was currently best practice would be locked in for the next 5 years is what investors should basically report and act on. And so that's important because the field, as you say, is still evolving, and we are still learning about different options around what can be done. But I think actually the evolution in terms of risk assessment is different than in terms of the climate friendliness one, because in the climate friendliness one, I would argue until about last year, there was really a big flux about what even to do and what to think about. And as we've organized the 2° Invest Awards this year with the French Treasury and the Environment Ministry, there's a lot more transparency. Now on the risk side, it's not such a big concern because risk assessment is the bread and butter of financial markets. So if you're unable to assess these types of risks, it's not really part of the DNA of finance to say, okay, these risks are unassessable, so we should wait until we have a model to assess them. Although I will say that obviously the accuracy and granularity of assessment is likely to become better, and the ability to price these risks is likely to improve. The campaigning and asking for regulators or companies or financial institutions to conduct these risk assessments is always in the cards, in my view, because it's part of the basic DNA of how financial markets work and are meant to reflect, basically allocate capital. I will have to say that I have to unfortunately sign off now because I'm going to be running into next meeting, and unfortunately I was just blocked until about 10 past.
Oh, okay.
So I'm sorry. It's one of the speakers to jump off a little bit early, but I do appreciate everybody joining this webinar, and please send an email if you have any other follow-up questions that I've been able to answer at this stage.
Thanks ever so much for your excellent contribution. Thank you. Rens, go ahead.
If I may just add to Jakob, I'm very strongly of the opinion that it's even though the methodologies are far from perfect, the only way to get them improved is actually to keep running this exercise and well, learn on the job, so to say. And actually that has been a little bit my frustration. So I think it's very interesting to have heard the other presenters today who are actually doing exactly where we left off, saying now you have to look to the rest of the economy as well. But I'm a bit, so I think the good development over the last 2 years, so to say, has been that increasingly regulators are seeing this as a material topic and asking questions about it. But so far I have not seen very much from financial institutions themselves actually showing, some of them are of course doing exercises, but little is shown from that. And from what my personal experience with financial institutions, I cannot say that I'm very impressed about what they have been doing so far. So I think if you talk about campaigning, it should really be not only about do these kind of stress tests, but also show how you did it and what has come out of that, because I think that's very important also to further raise the awareness of the possible impact of these scenarios. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree basically with what has been said. I think that it's a very evolving field, and applying it would bring a lot of learning effects. So I think it should definitely be applied more by investors, but also by regulators to really learn from in the process of implementing stress tests. Maybe start with specific sectors where the information level is better, and then add sectors one by one or add different dimensions. And so because I think right now there's a lot of or the big focus is on disclosure by the FSB and also by the G20 Green Finance Study Group, and then the next that's the first step. I think there is a lot is happening there right now, and then the next step is obviously what do you do with all this information that becomes available, hopefully, and then this how to develop practices or good practices on how to deal with this information and to make useful stress test scenarios, I think is very important. So, and this comes before probably the third step of regulation. And We have talked, for example, to the finance ministry in Germany, and their standpoint so far is that there's no time for regulation yet, because we don't know enough really about the impact. So before regulation will come, sort of the first step is disclosure, and the second is stress test. So I think it's very important that more is done there on this level.
Yeah. Okay. That's super interesting. We have a few more questions, but we're running out of time, and I think we're people are slowly dropping off. So you're very welcome to email your questions, and we'll pass them on. But I think it's best to stop right now. And thanks ever so much again to Franziska and Rens and Jakob, who's left, for their great contributions. It was really thought-provoking and covering a wide range of fields. We're running these skill shares on a regular basis. Do sign up to our newsletter. That's on the next slide.
Thank you very much as well for organizing it and the opportunity.
Thanks for having you. Keep in touch.